Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing some more Sharks news. There has been a lot to say this season with some of the big things that have happened around the Sharks organization. The Couture injury, the Hurdle injury, the Carlson injury, some of the Kane suspensions that he's faced this season, and now we're going to have another regular for the Sharks not in the lineup coming the next game, but not because he's injured, not because he's suspended, but because he was traded. Brendan Dillon was traded today to the Washington Capitals in exchange for a second-round pick and a conditional third-round pick. And before you get up in arms about this condition on the third-round pick, it's not the usual, well, if the player re-signs, you get a third, but if he doesn't re-sign, you get nothing, and then normally the player doesn't end up re-signing. Instead, it's basically if the Capitals win the Stanley Cup, the Sharks get Arizona's third-round pick that the Capitals have possession of instead of the Capitals' third-round pick themselves, meaning if the Capitals win the Stanley Cup, since the Caps will likely finish above the Coyotes in the standings, the Sharks would move up a few spots in the third round. Not a huge deal, so basically think of it as a second-round pick and a third-round pick. And I know the Sharks were sort of gunning to try and get maybe a late first rounder, but they likely would have had to add assets to this trade if they wanted to try and get Washington's first round pick, and it seems as though Doug Wilson was maybe unwilling to do that, or the Caps themselves were unwilling to do it, and so getting a second and a third round pick in return for Dillon is pretty much what you would have expected if it was just sort of one player moving from the Sharks to the other team. And it's somewhat unfortunate to see Dillon traded, even though it was sort of an inevitability once the Sharks came out of the All-Star break and didn't look all that great still. Dillon was a player who was once acquired for Jason Demers, and that was a pretty controversial trade at the time. I thought at the time as well that Demers was the better player, and Dillon wasn't really doing much at all impressive during those first couple of seasons with the Sharks to make me think that the trade was worth it. And obviously, infamously, he had that pairing with Roman Polak in the 2016 playoffs, and he looked pretty much outpaced at every turn against the Pittsburgh Penguins in that Stanley Cup Finals. But in the past few years, he has really solidified himself as a top four defenseman in the NHL. He's been very good for the Sharks, continuously among the top, if not just leading in terms of hits. He stands up for his teammates. He plays some solid defensive hockey. He can get on the penalty kill, and while his offensive game is certainly nothing to write home about, really it barely exists, he's certainly made a great compliment for Erik Karlsson last season when Karlsson failed to find chemistry with Vlasic, and has made a good compliment as well with Brent Burns at times. So certainly a player who's going to help the Washington Capitals in their run for the Stanley Cup. I was surprised that the Capitals would acquire him, as they do have a player in Radko Gudas who fills a pretty similar role. But of course, when you're a team that really seems to be on the brink, the Capitals only won the Stanley Cup just a couple of years ago, you probably just acquire the assets that you feel even will just put you slightly more so over the top, and that's what Dillon is going to do for the Capitals. So unfortunately, the Sharks will lose one of their better defensemen, and with now Erik Karlsson and Brendan Dillon gone, we'll see how it ends up filling out. I suspect Jacob Middleton might find himself in the lineup once more. Class dismissed.